Okay. Oh. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Brackendale Art Gallery. Tonight, we're kicking off the Squamish Historical Society Fall Speaker Series. And tonight, we're going to have Ellen Grant come up, and she'll be speaking about the role of geography in the settlement and historical development of our valley. Now, I'll just give you a little bit of background about Ellen. Ellen is the granddaughter of settlers Barbara Annie and Harry Judd. And if any of you know about Judd Road, down there is where she grew up and her family, generations of Judds, came from. 6 generations of her family have made this area their home. She has lived in the valley for 70 plus years and taught in the schools here for 37 of those years until retirement. The valley has been her playground and her teacher. She has explored every nook and cranny. She hopes to bring her personal experiences and opinions to a discussion of the valley's past and perhaps a possible glimpse of our future during a question and answer period after. Ellen Grant.
Well, I am repeating something that I did at a quest earlier this year, and it started out up there as just talking to the children, the school children. But it expanded, and the next day I went on and did a talk, the same topic, for the other guests on Saturday. I was going to repeat the same thing today, and it's a good thing I am, because I did notes today while I was homeschooling a kindergarten granddaughter. And somehow or other, my notes got into a craft project that she was doing. And so I'm ad-libbing. So if it looks a little disjointed, that's fine. You can pick me up in the question and answer and comment deal at the end, and I can fill in the spots that are missing. Geography has not always been my subject. I loved history, but thinking back to my own schooling, I remember the teacher pulling down the map of the world, and I spent more time looking at the chocolate bars on the bottom than I did looking at the map. There were teachers in elementary school who wanted to get geography across to me, and I remember one teacher who did the lowlands of Holland and the Swiss Alps. But I was more interested in the fact that she read the story of Hans Brinker and the Silver Skates and Heidi than I did about the geography of those two countries. I also had a teacher who decided that teaching the geography of the United States should be done with music. And so I know all about the Yellow Rose of Texas and sidewalks of New York and the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. But some of them didn't quite fit. I don't think they could get them with the title in there. So we did have, instead of Florida, we have way down upon the Swanee River. And I know where the Swanee River is, by the way. So I never really, to me, geography was the thing that you memorized the capital cities and the main rivers and where they were. But it was that introduction to Greece and Rome and the pyramids and that. That was the part that I was interested in, not where they took place. I knew that there was sand in Egypt, and I knew that Greece had lots of islands, but basically my interest was in history. And as far as I was concerned, I was into that romantic deal, you know, like my relatives were the ones that lived in the castles and not in the peasants and eating the brown bread. And to me, I was always the one that was riding the camels across the desert, you know, like in the Desert Song and all this type of stuff. And I always only went back to written history. I thought prehistory was for some of the wild boys in my class, and I could quite sure relate them right back to their other ancestors. But as far as I was concerned, I stopped at written history. So geography was never a big importance to me. It was there and had to be learned, and that was it. And even when I was here in the valley, I always took for granted the mountains and the streams and the rivers and such that we had here. And even, of course, history growing up here in the valley was never my forte. I was living the history, and you don't, when you're living with these people, sure, you hear the stories, but they're just the stories like your parents told you or your grandparents told you. And then one day, I was doing a talk for a French class up in the high school, Don Ross, and I suddenly thought, holy Moses, I've lived in this valley longer than my grandfather. And it just floored me that I made as much history as he did, or was connected with as much history. And that's how I became interested really in history as history and not the storytelling that I had been told. And then after I retired, there was a school back, a private school back in Ontario, and they were bringing one of their classes out to Squamish, and I was asked if I would give a talk about Squamish. And I said, oh, okay. And that's all I knew. I mean, no one said they wanted me to tell this or that. So I threw in a little bit of this and that. You know, some history, some geography, some economy, a little bit of the future deal. And it wasn't until I got to the section of the feedback, the question and answer. The students started asking me, these were high school students, and they started asking me some very pointed questions. So when it was over, I got a hold of the teacher from back in Ontario, and I said, listen, what was their assignment? And she said, oh, we are here to look at how the geography of the people in this community affected their history. And then we're going back and comparing how the geography of our situation has affected our history and development. And I thought, oh, I had always done the paradigm the other way around. I had always looked at history, and geography didn't make it, it just was there. What if I looked at it the other way around and geography was there and the history came on top of it? Aha. So tonight I want to sort of see if I can give you that paradigm, because I know that a lot of you know the history, and I want to thank the Squamish Historical Society for doing that. A lot of people have come into Squamish and have been curious about living here and have researched, probably much better than I know, mine is just anecdotal, the history of this valley. And I want to thank them for actually recording that material, because I can't remember all those stories I heard around the dining room table, believe me, and I don't know the details. But Squamish is a very special, special place to me. It was it's a place that was formed by fire and ice. We are part of the ring of fire that circles the Pacific Ocean, and Garibaldi is our signal point. It is, or was, an active volcano, and it's in the same area as Mount Baker and all the other ones, and we have indication that very close to the surface, we still have lava in that peak. We have hot springs in various places up in Pemberton, and my grandmother always said that there was a spot on Round Mountain that had a hot spring. I have not been able to find it, and she never pointed out, but from her kitchen window she always said, see that spot up there? It's green all year round. And she said there's a hot spring there. I think there's a university there now, but there was. And so although we haven't had a volcanic eruption, not in my lifetime or any of my ancestral beginning lifetime, there's always a possibility. The other ice that we had was we were part of the great ice blanket that covered this entire region, in fact, all the way across Canada, except I understand for the Queen Charlotte Islands or Hideaway. It's supposed to have escaped it. And actually, I think that I once heard that Bowen Island and the islands in the Gulf in Howe Sound escaped it. You can see the markings of the glaciers. You just have to look at the Chief and that huge rock on the one side that they uncovered when they enlarged the highway with the nice lines along the sides of it. You can tell that that's where the glaciers have receded and are continuing to recede. If you take a good look at the mountains right now, you can see that this is one of the years that the glaciers have receded quite dramatically. When the glaciers receded for the last time, it left a beautiful fjord, Howe Sound, and an area at the north of it that eventually became the Squamish Valley. It wasn't probably always, but the river coming out, the Squamish River, it has laid down most of the material that created this valley. And so, the river has played a huge role in the development, prehistoric and now, in this valley. And I'll touch on that a little later on. The first settlers coming up here were not the first ones to arrive, the first white settlers. Squamish had been used as a gathering place and actually a place for living for the Squamish nation for millennia, well, I don't know how long before. They had found the Squamish Valley to be a very great place for two particular things, the salmon and the cedar. The cedar tree was almost the lifeblood of these people. They used it for making canoes for transportation, for building their houses. They used it for the bark, for making clothing, particularly hats. They used the roots for making the baskets. The cedar tree was particularly important because it has an oil in it that prevents it from rotting quickly. And so it was used for their totem poles. It was the essential building block of their nation. The salmon, which were abundant at that time, particularly in Howe Sound, were their main food source. Of course, they had the berries, and this valley was full of salmon berries and boysenberries and thimbleberries and multitude of berries. It also had a lot of other things that they used for medicinal purposes. And the way that they got up to here was by canoe. They had headquarters down at the Capilano River, the mouth of the Capilano River, and present Stanley Park. And they had territory up here, particularly at the mouth of the Squamish River, at the Delta. And they came up to do their fishing and their collecting. And I know that even when I was a girl, at the mouth of Judd Slough, which is now really a slough, at that time it was a big arm of the Squamish River, they had a smokehouse where they would smoke their salmon. And although when I was a little girl, it wasn't in actual use, it was still there. And I remember going down and standing and thinking about what it would be like to have actually been with them when they were smoking. And my mother said that she remembered when they did their smoking at the smokehouse, they had rituals that they did, and she remembers hearing them and actually going down and watching when she was a little girl. So they actually, with their canoes, were able to come from Vancouver up to Squamish, up the rivers, as far as, at least as far as Judd Slough. I think they actually went as far as the Chapanas with their canoes. They were expert boatsmen. When one of the first white people to see Squamish was George Vancouver. And of course, he sailed up. He wasn't looking for fish and he wasn't looking for timber. He was looking for a route to China or the Northwest Passage, whichever came first. He was looking for a way around this province. And of course, he was a bit disappointed. Also disappointed because it came in a rainstorm. Too bad he didn't come this summer. And he went back down again. But there were other people that came up. There were people looking for gold in the 1880s. There were people who were looking for a route from the interior to drive their cattle down to market. And they made a route down from Pemberton, and they fed their cattle on the grasslands down at the mouth of the Squamish. The poor cows, they were so poorly fed on the route. They went through the pass into Pitt River and down. That they only tried it once, I think, and decided to abandon that. But the trail, remnants of the trail are still there because people moving up and down the route between here and Pemberton used it, and the horses, it was a good horse trail back and forth. But the first settlers, of course, coming into Squamish, they had to come by water. My grandfather, his first trip up was as a surveyor, and they were brought up by the natives in canoes, and they surveyed up here. And the reason that they surveyed up here is because the railroad, the new transcontinental railroad, were looking for another place to have its terminus, and they thought this might be a good place. And Squamish was surveyed from the other side of the Squamish River all the way across to the other side and right up, because they figured that this was really going to develop. And this here is a picture of the town site office of Newport. They even gave it a fancy name, Newport. It wasn't called Squamish, it was called Newport. And my grandfather's brother came out from Ontario and became a real estate agent. Maybe one of the first real estate agents that we had here in the valley. And they were selling them sight unseen. In fact, they took the survey results back to Vancouver, and they actually had raffles so that people could buy these lots. My grandfather, who would help survey, he didn't manage to get one of the raffle deals, but one of his cousins did, and he bought the lot off of the cousin. It happened to be on the banks of the Mapkin River. And without any dikes, you know, the Mapkin River actually flooded about twice a year. And he soon abandoned that and took up the property that is now on Judd Road and is now Tamaristani's and Lauren Badger. That is the old homestead. I live on the old homestead too, but mine is just an acre now. My grandfather, besides being a surveyor, was also what was called a clerk. Now that wasn't a grocery store clerk. It was the other name for an accountant, because he had quite a schooling back in Ontario. And when he came out, he had made friends with a group of young fellows from England. probably the third sons. They were called Remittance Men, I think, at that time. Young boys in their late teens and early 20s, and they were out to have some fun. They were exploring, and however, they were all city people, and they had absolutely no idea of how to do things. So all they had was lots of energy. The first trip they made, they got themselves a rowboat. I think there was 6 of them. And they ended up Bowen Island, and one of them fell off a cliff and badly sprained an ankle, and the other one shot himself in the hand. But they didn't give up. They got back into their rowboat and they came back. They come up to Squamish. They didn't have much time. If you got 2 weeks holiday in those days, that was something remarkable. Usually it was just, a couple of days or a long weekend. So they went back to Vancouver, and the next time they decided, instead of the rowboat, they were going to hire the natives to bring them up in a real dugout canoe. So they rowed up. I know this because my grandfather wrote a diary in the form of letters to his mother back in Ontario. And when he got back from one of his adventures, he would send this diary to us. And fortunately, my great-grandmother saved them. And they are now in the archives in Victoria. But they are quite hilarious because of the adventures that they went through. The second time up, the natives brought them up, but they said, and dropped them off, because they were going to go blaze their way through the jungle of Devil's Club and salmon berries and such. And they were going to survey out where they wanted to homestead. Well, when it came time that the natives were supposed to come back, I guess the time was not the same. They had a different schedule, the natives and the white fellows. So they decided they were going to build a dugout canoe. Well, they dug out this dugout canoe. I can imagine what it would be like. And they were about to launch it when their native group came back. And of course, they were given the ha-has about this deal and said, no, we don't mind. It was up where the Chica-Chakamas enters the Squamish. And so sure enough, they climbed into this dugout, started down the river, and fortunately, the natives followed them. Because if they hadn't, I wouldn't be here today. Let's put it that way. So the only way to get in and out of Squamish at that time, and for a long time, was by water. Gradually, as more people came into the valley and settled here, we had bigger and bigger boats arriving. They didn't always come on time. It depended on the tides. It depended on whether we had a Squamish wind. It depended on a multitude of things. By the time I was born in 1940, they had steamships coming, and these are the same steamships that actually went up the coast to Bellacoola and to Kitimat and beyond. They had staterooms. They had a gorgeous dining room. I still got sick every time I went into town. But they were fancy dining. As close to fancy dining as anyone in Squamish ever got to enjoy. So everyone enjoyed the trip down. You got to meet people. And of course, the bigger the boat, the more cargo they could bring in too. And so Squamish relied on these boats to bring supplies in. To bring in flour and milk. Well, no, not milk, because we got milk here. But anything that was out of the ordinary. Like, if you wanted bananas, wow, you had to wait for the boat to bring it in. if you wanted medicines, you had to wait for the boat. If you wanted just about anything like that, if you wanted a new bed, if you wanted, well, anything, you had to wait for the boat to bring it in. The first boats had a lot of trouble getting in. Again, for the tides. Squamish was a series of low-lying islands at that time. Really low-lying. I mean, during the high tides, during heavy rainstorms, during floods on the rivers, Squamish was a mud pie at the best. During high tides, the water came in to what were called sloughs. I mean, I raised ducks as a little girl on one of them. And of course, low tide, it would go out. And over all of these were bridges. There were road bridges and sidewalk bridges and logs that went across these. Anywhere you went in the community, you had to go over these deals. And this was in 1940. Well, it had to be about older than that because I wasn't going over the logs. But when I was a kid, 4 or 5 years old I was, and I remember the main street of Squamish being so muddy that they had boards across it, planks, to walk from one side to the other. You couldn't go across otherwise because it was muddy. And one of the reasons was because the dairy had their cows at the other end feeding off the grass, the same grass that probably the early settlers were doing. And every morning and every night they brought the cattle up through the main street. So that was even after it had been diked. I mean, one of the first things that the settlers did was dike downtown Squamish. Why they bothered was because the only way to get goods in was by water. When my great-grandparents came to visit my grandma and grandpa, my great-aunt, Rilla, she came along and she was another person who kept a diary. And so she was telling about getting off the boat out in the Sound and getting into a canoe and coming up what is now the Malcolm Channel, dry channel, blind channel, and getting off because the boat that had brought her in could not get in because it was low tide. And from there, they had to go on to a buggy to come up the valley to my grandfather's homestead. But they had to dike because that was the landing spot for the goods coming in, and this is where they had the warehouses, this is where they had the stores, this is where they had the landing point for anyone coming into town. In fact, Mackenzie's store, which is now, well, you know where Mackenzie's Plaza is. They keep changing who's there, but Sears is there now. And they had a department store downstairs, and upstairs they had, I'm trying to think, about 6 suites. That was all the lodging that there was. There were no apartment buildings, there were no rental anything. When they started the BC Rail, or the PGE, they had houses built. In fact, they had houses built for any group of people coming in. If you were a logger, they built bunkhouses. If they were BC Rail or the railroad people, they built for them houses and bunkhouses. Anybody that was coming in, teachers coming in, they made teacherages. Because there were no apartment buildings, there were no condominiums, there were none of that. So when you first arrived, of course there was no cars. It had to be someplace where you could walk to. So once they got the dikes in, it didn't really do a lot, but it made the Squamish area firmer. It wasn't until the federal government decided that it was in their best interest to take and dredge out the north end of Howe Sound. And when they dredged it out so their boats can get in, so the barges for the railway cars could come in, that they took the dredgings and they started to fill in the sloughs around Squamish. And it was only because of that Squamish today is not the mud hole that it was when I was a kid. And if you look at some of the pictures, some of the historical pictures, you will see the bridges on all of the roads because they were going over the sloughs. My dad built a house across from the high school. And at that time, we had to have septic tanks. He put in a septic tank. He could not put a base in it, because every time the tide would come up, it would take it out. And that's the way it was in Squamish. There was a lady, Mrs. Barr, maybe some of you know Norm Barr or some of the grandchildren, down on the main street, down, trying to locate it for people where it is now. It used to be by the old theater. There was a heavy metal shop there that he repaired logging trucks. And his wife lived next door, and she loved to garden. She had a beautiful garden, roses and everything. And every year he filled her front lawn with soil. Because every year the tide coming in and going out would take the bottom out of her yard. When they retired up by the high school where it wasn't quite so bad, and they built their property way up so that they had enough to last them the rest of their lifetime. But Squamish, the water, it was a huge thing. It meant that we received supplies. When the railroad went in, they had a slip so that box cars came in, and the box cars came in with everything from grain and machinery and tools and what have you. But because we were isolated, because we didn't have a road or a railroad, and by the way, for as long back as we were a community, and that's what, at least 100 years, politicians always said, we will get you a road. We promise you a road. And the same, when the railroad went through, we weren't supposed to be the terminus of the PGE. That was supposed to always be in Vancouver. But they started working there, and they started working up at Chikai on the railroad. And it took, 50 years? At least 50 years to get the connection made. And the first trip through the road, the official opening of the road was delayed because of a slide. And the railroad, both the road and the railroad actually, had problems so that you couldn't count on it. In fact, I think if you've lived here for any length of time, you know that that highway and that railroad have been washed out more times than you can count on all your fingers and all your toes. And so we got to the point where we always felt we were sort of isolated, but that didn't hurt. Because when you are isolated, you start to rely on yourself. You, in effect, become pioneers. And this community was strong because of that isolation. We weren't like our neighbors, Britannia and Woodfibre, who were company towns. towns who had the company bringing stuff in for them and everything. We did it on our own. And we relied on each other. I won't say we did it on our own individually. We did it on our own as a community. We built things like golf courses and hospitals and what have you. We put on our own events. We entertained each other. We had lots of good laughs. I know that my mother was up in Kamloops during the Depression, helping one of her sisters up there. And she got a letter from her mother. And they were worried. Of course, everybody was worried during the Depression, like, how are you doing? How are you making out? You know, starve? And my grandmother said, no one in this valley will ever starve. We're sharing. And it's true. Every house had fruit trees, had chickens, had a garden, had things that you could can. And at this time of year, they were busy canning. And believe me, their fall fairs were things to behold. I mean, our fall fair is great. But the main thing about the fall fair in those days was the produce. Not only did they have the things like that, we had the beehive, but there was at least one dairy operating here all the time. The butchers in the stores killed their own cattle that were here. I know my dad, who worked in a butcher shop, he actually sold rabbits, even during the war, because he sold them as chicken. But that's what people did. They raised what they could, and like my grandmother, she could raise rhubarb, and so, well, of course, I was a little smaller in those days. But I know that her rhubarb was at least this high, because I could hide in it. And the stalks were huge. And she traded those off to Mackenzie stores for other things that she needed, like sugar or flour or something like that. But people had pigs and cows and chickens and goats and what have you. And they traded. There was a lot of trading going on. And when I see things happening at the Fall Fair and in the Upper Squamish right now, it takes me back, because that's the way it was. And that's the way Squamish is. That's sort of even the young people, I'm amazed, the people coming into Squamish from other places, and I talk to them and I say, what caused you to come to this valley? And of course, one of the big things is the surroundings, which I have always taken for granted. But the other thing is that they are able to do things with their hands, to produce things and make a living out of it, which they find really remarkable. But to get back to the water always hasn't been good to us. Like I said, we have the rivers. And although the rivers have always been overflowing with fish, in fact, at one time, we were considered the steelhead capital of Canada. And people came up here to fish our rivers. We're thrilled with the fishing that went on here, the freshwater fishing. But the Squamish River, the Squamish was built because it was a river that flowed back and forth and built up a serpentine river, and it built Squamish up. And then when people started to settle, they said, hey, you're not cutting through my property. And so we had to have some way of controlling it. One of the first things to control the Squamish River was called the Carson Cut. And that was down on the Squamish River, down close to Squamish. Because the Squamish River was threatening to come right through and cut. Well, at one time it had cut through. There was a bridge that went over the Blind Channel. The Blind Channel used to run behind the high school. You can see it in there now. And and out and join the Squamish River over farther. And it threatened to do that again. In other words, get in behind the dikes and take out Squamish again. So the Carson cut put the river back over against the mountain. We're very fortunate. We've got a very solid bank on the one side of the Squamish River. I mean, I don't think they're going to move the Tantalus Range. Right? Drop by drop, it's going to take a while anyway. But we do have the main part here. And then we had a section up in Brackendale that caused a problem. The Squamish River decided that it was going to come over and take up the highway. There used to be a school there, a private school, and it's now the Lions camp. And when I was a girl, you drive along the highway where the river is, where the Eagle Run area is, and you didn't see the river at all. There was actually a farm in there, and I can remember it had a roadway going into it, and you had to look a long ways along that road before you saw the farmhouse. Well, if that was there today, I would assume that that farmhouse was on the other side where the eagles nest in those trees. And bango, one spring it was gone, the whole thing. And then they tried other things. They ran breakwater that took the creek that comes down by the powerhouse there. They had a breakwater that took that creek way out into what would be the middle of the river now. It was wonderful because it built up with sand on the other side. And in the summertime, there was nice pools of water in the sandbar. And as a teenager and all us kids, we used to go and we'd jump in these nice warm pools. Actually, some of them were deep enough to dive into. And then we would go into the creek where it was nice and fairly warm because it came down from Alice Lake. And then we would go and jump in the Squamish River. But that was a great deal. But of course, that has all been washed out. If you go to the, see, I don't know the bar's names up there.
Watershed?
Watershed. If you go to the watershed and you look out, that sandbar would have gone right across the river. That's how big that sandbar was. It was huge, and it had the most beautiful, soft, gorgeous sand on it. It was absolutely wonderful. But it was only there for maybe 3 or 4 years. We had great fun on it. In fact, if any of you have been down to the fisherman's deal farther up the river and come down on the sandbar there, you know what quality of sand it is. It's really quite nice. They had to put in a road eventually. I mean, there's only so much of the valley you can get to by going up the Squamish River in a canoe. But most of the early travel was done along game trails. They just widened the game trails a bit, and that's what they did. Until they brought in the first cars. My grandfather was had the first car in the valley. Like I said, my grandfather was a jack of all trades, and he was all sorts of things. And they built Government Road. Called Government Road because the government built it. And it did have a few problems. Again, with water. The Mapkin River liked to flood. Because it has a shorter runoff than the Squamish River, it usually can rise in about 6 to 8 hours after a real good downpour. And it rushes down with a tremendous power. And it liked to take out anything in its path, including bridges. I can remember one of my first memories was going across the Mapkin River in a canoe to visit my grandparents. I think that was in about 1944. I can remember that. And I can also remember, it used to go out many times. What they often did is it got a backup of logs against it. They would take and actually blow the bridge with dynamite so that it would break up the log jam, so that when it did go, it wouldn't take out the railroad bridge, which was downstream a bit from it, still is. And I remember in high school riding the school bus over the railroad bridge for about 2 or 3 months while they rebuilt, because they had to blow the other bridge. So if you talk about isolation, you might have to say that Brackendale folks really know about isolation. You get so that you even know how to grind your own flour and various things. You really make do. And like I said, the adventure of going over the railroad bridge was really great. We also had other adventures because, like I said, the government road was not paved either for a very, very long time. And I remember the school bus I was in losing a back tire into the mud and walking home. It was like that. I mean, I was in high school then, so hey, that was in the 50s. I guess that's quite a while ago. Doesn't feel like it because it feels like yesterday. The other rivers also are never really quite kind to us. The Squamish has been known to give the residents along its banks a rough time. The Squamish and especially the Chica. The Chica is a toughy one. It, again, is very rapid, and if you go along its banks, you will see rocks the size of houses that it has pulled down. Not only that, there's a spot on the Chica just before it gets to the road to Whistler, where well, they've worked on it a bit now, they've diked it a bit now, but at one time, if it had come up that much more, it would have gone right down the highway, right into the Garibaldi Estates, right into the Mount Mary. It was scary, because we were up there watching it. But the Mount area has also been flooded. I remember, not just around the golf course, I remember everything right up to what we used to call Lesky's Crossing being underwater. I remember all down by the Mount, or down by the shops. By the way, the area around the shops, all the houses that were built up around there were for people who were working in the shops. And many of them were originally temporary, because remember that railroad was supposed to be through in no time. So there were neat little cottages and everything, but they weren't intended to be, forever. But they are. There's people living in them now, and have made them really nice, and they've got nice little gardens and everything. But at one time, the water was right up over the railroad tracks in that area. In other words, the people had to climb out their upstairs windows because of the flooding. The area where the museum is was always flooded. I'll bet you that was flooded. I remember going on the school bus that was flooded every year. It was flooded at the wink of an eye. Of course, we used to have really good rains. Not these little teeny that we're getting this year. I mean, rains that rained and rained and rained, and we never knew when it was going to stop. We figured we were under a waterfall. In fact, if you saw the sunshine, everybody would run out and say, hallelujah, But, and that rainwater, even when you've got a dike, if if you don't have some way to get rid of the rainwater, you've got it diked in. So you pretty well have to consider how to get it out as well as in and in as well as out type of thing. In fact, the only flood that I had in my part of the deal, because I was smart, I put the surveyor deal on my parents' place, which is my grandfather's place, and we raised it 2 inches. So we didn't get any water in. But my grandmother got water in her place just after she had put down new linoleum. You didn't put hardwood down in, new linoleum. It came in just this far, but enough to leave a layer of silt in her house. My grandfather never lived it down. Some surveyor you are! You told me the water never got this high. That was before the era of the vacuum cleaner, of course, before we had electricity. But with ours, what happened is they had made arrangements with the dikes. They have a pump house on Judd Slough, and they have piping going across to Horse Creek. And the whole idea was, when the water in Squamish got so high, they had a gate that shut, so that the water from the Squamish River would not come in Horse Creek. And it would be pumped up and out into Judd Slough. The only thing is, somebody forgot to put the pump in. And so, when the river started to come up, we thought, nothing to worry about, they just turned the pumps on. They just didn't turn the pumps on. But we didn't get water in our place, but several people along our street did. But you have to think about all the options. Because remember that downtown Squamish still has the water coming in underneath. You still have the tidal flow, even though you've got the ground on top. You walk down the street and you're not sinking, you're not floating on wooden sidewalks like we once did. You still have the tidewater coming in and going out. And twice a day. And it goes up quite a ways, at least as far as the high school. You also know that here in Brackendale, as you go down the road and you get to the Brackendale store, that's the edge of the Chikai Fan. At one time there was a huge slide prompted by the Chikai River, and it covered the Brackendale area. And that's the edge of it. And you'll find swampy area all along where the edge is. Because the water's seeping off of the fan. I mean, water's gotta go somewhere. It comes down and it flows out. And that's what it does. And the same thing with the river. The river runs that you can see out there, and you can see where the Mapkin River runs and so on, but it also seeps underneath. And once you get the water table coming up, from rain and from the level of the river, you have it behind your dikes. So water has been not only our transportation, it also has been our bane. It's been the thing we fought with, are continuing to fight with, and should. Unless we want to have houseboats. Now, when the railroad and road finally came through, it was quite an adventure. Just to ride in the trains. The people at Squamish, the only way we would ride in the trains was be going north. You know, we would go up to Littlewood, or we'd go up to Williams Lake, because the north opened up to us on the train before it opened up to us below. We went into Vancouver for doctors and dentists and lawyers and bankers and architects and engineers, and you know, that's where we did our big heavy business in the early days. So when the road and railroad opened, a lot of those kind of businesses came into Squamish. But a lot of other things happened. I remember my graduation class, the boys left about 10 o'clock. Bango. They all got in cars and they went over the new highway. It wasn't open, it was just gravel, and they spent the night in Stanley Park. And hey, they thought it was terrific. I can remember after that, them coming back and saying, boy, we're going to have to do something about that hill going down out of Furry Creek. Wow, you get to the bottom of it, boy, you could end up right in the ocean. They had visions of, you know, taking off. And they said, we don't even think the cop cars could get down there that fast. It was, you know, it was exciting because here, everyone couldn't wait to get out. They were going to university, they were going to take trade, they were going to travel the world. That was the big deal. And for a long time it did. We had a few visitors come in who enjoyed Alice Lake. The road to Whistler wasn't open. Well, you could get to Whistler, but I mean, it wasn't something that normal people would try. It took a while for people to find an equilibrium there. For kids to come back to Squamish, for people, as I said, to find doctors and lawyers and tradespeople in our own community. We built a hospital and pulled doctors and nurses and top of the line people here. We built a golf course, one of the best in Canada. We built a hockey rink. We built, of course with the taxes, but also by hand, by volunteering. I bet Squamish has more volunteers per capita than any other place in Canada. In fact, most people volunteer for so many things they have to keep a schedule. I mean, honestly, I don't know how they get time to work, really. It's amazing what a small community can do. At one time we had more churches per capita than any other place in Canada. It was amazing. I don't know, I think people must have gone to 2 or 3 because I don't know how they ever got a congregation. But it's something that has focused this community, the fact that we have this feeling amongst us that is so great. And even though the things that gave us our tax base, logging and the railroad, for many years have sort of gone away, we are building a different community, but we are building it on the geographical and historical background that has been given to us as a legacy. No one's ever going to take that chief away from us. No one is ever going to harness our rivers completely. No one is going to give us bad air, I hope. We had enough of that with wood fiber. But at one time, you know, Squamish was actually advertised as being the fresh air capital, the place to go from Vancouver. They came up here to get fresh air. To take the air is what they called it. And it was considered, because cities were considered to be, with their smoke and their smog and their closeness, to be places of disease. And the women came up here and sat in hammocks and sewed and knit and gossiped, and the men went out and fished or climbed Garibaldi. The Mountaineers Club of Canada loved this valley because of the mountains. And the other day I was down next to Nestor's and I was looking at those maps, And I was amazed. I mean, I have climbed a lot around them. I'm not a climber, but I did do 10 years of marriages here after I retired, and I was up on the mountains every summer. And I don't know how you keep track of the names of them all. So all I know is that's the Tantless Range. I'm not going to know any. And Mount Jimmy, I know, is named after one of our native fellows. And I know that Cloudburst Mountain is up there, because I have done weddings in the rain up there. You know, the valley is full of interesting places. Something I learned from that map was that BC Hydro actually has a cable car going across the Squamish River. Have any of you ever been across on that? Something I haven't. I'm not going to try that. It connects evidently some of the trails and the huts up on the Lake Water and such. You can live here a whole lifetime. You can travel by helicopter and plane and foot and snowshoe and ski all over this place, and you won't touch a tenth of what this valley has to offer. You can't possibly see all the little lakes and rills and waterfalls and things that are here. We're so fortunate to have a trails route that are making it accessible. And a lot of those trails started off on railroad tracks that the loggers put in. And of course they've expanded now. They're like a spider's web, or one of those, the networks out of one of those horror stories. And they've got names to match them too. And my son, he comes home and says, "Oh, I just was up this one and down that one and over the..." Oh my God. I mean, he can do in one evening what used to take me at least a weekend to travel. And we had the handicap of not having little bridges over this and over that. So I hope I've given you a little bit of perspective that really it's where you live, where you're located in the globe, your climate, your physical place that you abide in, that makes all the difference in the world. That changes how you live and how your community grows, how you make your living. I mean, not very many people are loggers today, but a pile of them have got computers in their home that are using them to connect with the rest of the world. You don't have to have a logging truck parked outside in order to make a living. It's nice to have a logging truck here and there, though. Okay. Now, do I have any questions? I don't know if I can answer them. Yes?
I read this surveyor's report from, I think, around 1947.
Yes?
And so you would have been...
Not very old, but old enough.
Apparently we had a major earthquake here on that year.
Yes?
And he made a note of it. I was wondering if you...
Yes, I can remember that earthquake. Yeah, another ring of fire type of deal. Yes, it was a Sunday. And I remember standing out in the yard. At that time, I lived down in the parking lot, what's called the Red Balloon or something.
Red Apple.
Yeah. And looking up at the chief, and a big section of the chief came down. It's really funny. I did a wedding under a huge, huge rock. And as a couple of years ago, and as I was doing this wedding, I mean, we could fit 6 of us under this big rock at the base of the chief. I was thinking about that. Not that I would get hit, but wondering if that was one of the rocks that came down at that time. There was another one. I'm trying to think of what year it was. I was teaching at the time in Squamish, and of course, again, right close to the chief. And it was about 8:30 in the morning, and just, you know, because you look at and you think, wow, nothing can move that. But there are rocks that do come down.
Right.
It was an interesting time that went too. Any other observations? I'm sure that you people have done some research and you've got ideas and places you've been and.
You mentioned the flooding, and how much of that's been relieved by having the mouth of the Squamish River dredged? Because it seems to me that it would have been a natural dam prior to that.
Well, it built up. I mean, the estuary and all that has been built up over the years by the Squamish Amalgam, the whole system. And it wasn't the mouth of the Squamish as much as the mouth of the Blind Channel that was really dug up, because that's when they put the small boat harbor in. And but they also dredged right down along Nexon Beach area there. They filled that in because, like I said, there were huge ponds, lakes, sloughs all over Squamish. In fact, they raised the sidewalks up, built them out of wood, and you traveled, like when I went to school, from downtown Squamish to the Masher School, which is where the high school is there now. I walked on sidewalks, and I know that when I was in grade 1 and 2, there were some boys who were always teasing me. We had to come home for lunch. That was one of the deals. You had to go home for lunch. And they were always teasing me because I was a little shrimp. I was a skinny. And my dad said, well, don't let them do that. Stick up for yourself. So this one day I was coming home and they were walking on the railing of this sidewalk. And I turned around and I gave one of them a good push and hit the other one. And two of them went down into the swamp underneath. And I went home. I was mad. I stomped into my father. I remember saying, well, what's the matter with you? Well, there's a couple of boys that are wet. There must have been a couple of those ones whose history went right back. I'm sure of it. Although we did become friends later on. But, you know, it's, the sidewalks were like that. They actually had them tied to fences. So that when the water came up, the wooden sidewalks wouldn't float away. And I can remember the horses were allowed to roam wild. And I can remember laying in bed, listening to the horses walk on the wooden sidewalks that night. But you know, when you're living it, you don't think you're deprived or anything like that. You have a very rich, rich life. And you're surrounded by people, interesting people who are doing things and caring. And so it doesn't matter that you're living, these conditions are laughable now. And at that time, we didn't think that we were being deprived. And we didn't have television telling us that we should have, you know, a change of scenery. You paint your house every 2 years, or, you know, you have a new bedding every change of season. We didn't have that to tell us that we were being deprived. We thought we were having a very rich and fun-filled life. We had drama groups in town, we had choral groups, we had all the things, like I said, but everybody joined us. So how they managed to do it, I don't know. But, you know, I know my mom and dad belonged to, well, one of the groups, my dad worked at Mackenzie Stores. Mackenzie Stores was a center of activity. They were expected to put on Christmas gatherings. They were expected to put on community picnics. We put on every group. We belonged to the Rod and Gun Club. We belonged to the Elks. They had every possible group. There was women's groups and kids groups, and the RCMP or the police, they put on a gymnastics group for us. We didn't have a gymnasium in our school. We had the town hall, the community center, the PGE hall it was called, and they put on that. And there was the basketball teams that played with Britannia and wood fiber, and we had a wonderful life. And people who live here now seem to think that they have a wonderful life. I talked to, as I said, the people who come into the community and say, why are you living here? And they said, well, why not? We've got every possible sport you can probably imagine here. You've got Whistler, if you want high class, up at Whistler. You've got West Vancouver down there if you want high class. And if you can find a parking space, you can go into Vancouver. You know? But we've got everything here. And maybe that's just my attitude because I was raised here. Yes?
You talked about the water table and how it's always there and so on.
Yeah.
This is more of a comment than a question, but just last week, I was in downtown Squamish, right beside the new medical building on Cleveland there.
Yes.
And they were actually drilling. I couldn't figure out what they were drilling for, and so I actually watched because I was waiting for somebody in the building. And they were drilling down and down and down with this special equipment. And I watched and I counted as they pulled up and they finished what they were doing. There were, the sections that they were drilling were about 4 feet long, and then they kept adding another one and going down and down and down. And then I watched as they pulled them back up. And what they were doing, I think, was checking for how far down the water table was, because, and there were 10 sections that were each of them about 4 feet long. And then when they finally finished and they got them up to the top, that, you know, they were wet.
Yeah.
And it was just, you know, sand.
Yeah.
And wet sand, and I went, well, that's interesting, why are they doing that right now?
Well,
Yeah.
at one time, there was a drugstore there, Yarwood's drugstore, and that was about as fancy a medical clinic as we got. It was a drugstore, and then there was a doctor's dentist office like behind it, part of it. And you went up about 3 or 4 steps to go into it because it was raised up and it was on piles. And it was raised up because to the south of it, where the other medical clinic is, and part of that was one of the big sloughs. And there was actually a big bridge on the road on Cleveland that went over this slough, because this slough went right across the road to that parking lot where they have the market. Yeah. And it had water in it all the time. I mean, and on the other sides of the dikes, it was wet all the time. It was the sloughs and that. Up where what do they call it, the Chieftain Center? That was all sloughs. And all where all the seniors center, the amount of fill that had to go in there was incredible. I mean, the ducks used to love it. We used to have ducks and teal, and we didn't have as many geese at that time, but we had tons of, you know, the hunters used to go out and get their fill just in that swampy area. Yes?
So given just how you're describing all these areas, what's your take on the development going into some of these areas, proposed developments like the one at the end of Judd Road that they put in recently, all the housing there, and then the one they're proposing down in the Mexican Beach area?
Well, I'll tell you what, when I was a girl, I was not a little girl. My dad, we had the Brackendale store, and he used to pick up the mail and stuff supplies for the Brackendale store. And every day we would go down on the rickety old wharf and wait for the boat to come in. And that wind blew and blew and blew. And in the wintertime, sometimes it turned around and blew the other way. I always thought that was like saving up and just making it. And it used to blow for 3 days, the Squamish wind. And I thought to myself, I've always thought to myself, I sure wouldn't want to ever live here. There are people who love that. People who would will spend the time inside looking out. And, but I'm not that type of person. Maybe if I lived down there and I could see those, the fellows with the sails, the kite. Oh, they are beautiful to watch. Oh, man. It's like being a bird. And there are interesting things. I think that Nixon is a wonderful place to go, but not to stay. And so, and I have that feeling most of Squamish, downtown Squamish. I'm not a person who likes wind. So I'm where I belong. I'm up in Brackendale. The part where they have built right against the dike in Brackendale, I'm concerned about, mainly because I remember when that the Squamish River took that sudden turn, and a river can cut through a tremendous amount of dirt in a tremendous amount of a short time. I remember when it took the turn and then went down, it takes a right-hand turn. And all that area at one time was part of the Joyce Ranch, the pig ranch. I don't know what everybody calls it now. It's Eagle Run. And I remember going down and watching it take, it was like, you see pictures of the icebergs dropping into the sound and they come down in big sheets. Well, that's what the farmland was doing. It was just taking the whole farmland away. It was just scary. And they've diked it, but you've got to keep dikes up. You've got to keep them well controlled. You've got to watch for it coming underneath, because I've seen it come underneath that dike. I've seen it come under the mapkin dikes. I've seen it come under the mapkin dikes and flow right down through the industrial park, where the industrial park is now. Right down there, right into Dentfield, right down. And not just a little puddle. I mean, pouring out under the dike. I've seen that happen. So, you have to be vigilant. We haven't had the high rivers like that for a while. So you have to be vigilant. My grandparents lived in the valley without dikes. My grandfather said that it was a gift from his friends up in the Upper Squamish, because he chose a spot where the water went slowly and deposited silt. And he grew prize-winning crops on his land because of the silt. It was beautiful, beautiful soil. But in order for him to get good soil, it had to come from someplace. And that's how the valley has been built up, is depositing soil from one place to another place. So we have to be vigilant. We must keep those dikes. Because today it's not going to, if they break or they breach or they go under, you're going to have houses. Because there's people living there now. There's houses all through there. In fact, all through the lower part of Squamish. And we have to, as long as the dikes hold, hey, terrific. But we're no longer farmers. You know, we no longer, like I remember Mrs. Ray. I think there was an article about her being a relative of Emily Carr. They lived next door to my grandparents at one time. But their house was not raised up. Theirs was, well, it was raised up about 2 steps. And my mother says that she remembers there was a flood coming, and she was cooking for her family. And she cooked the meal until the wood actually floated out of the fire, out of the stove. And then she said, better get in the boat. She loaded up the food in the boat and went over to my grandparents. But it was part of life in those days. You know, you got flooded out, you built up again. Or, you know, you cleaned up stuff that caught on your fences, on the barbed wire fences. That was one of the big jobs that my mom said they always had to do after. And it was never called flood. My grandfather refused to call it a flood, it was high water. And after high water, you went out and you took all the wood and stuff, and you had a big bonfire with the wood that was caught up on your fences and things like that. And he had, I mean, there was always a plan. I remember the plan about, you know, that there was a spot in the hay loft, again, a big hay loft that they had above the barn. There was a spot there for the chickens, there was a spot for the pigs, there was a spot up there that you drove the cows up the ramp and you closed the doors and they were safe. Didn't matter that down below you got water. You just took them, rinsed it out the next spring, and that was it. But we don't live that kind of a life anymore, you know. And so we've got to protect what we've got, or go back to living that way. They didn't have electricity, so you didn't have to worry about the electricity going off, and you know, you pumped your water or you brought it from the spring. You know, it was a hard life, but it was a happy life. Very happy life. But I think we've got a big future coming. I think that we're already Vancouver's playground. I mean, every weekend. Just take a look. I mean, I remember when you go to Alice Lake and you were the only one there. Huh? Where's Alice Lake? I mean, someplace in that middle of that ring of people, and climbing the Chief or going in some of these trails. If you met someone, hey, you know, you stop and talk because you knew them. But today, heck, they could be from anywhere. Timbuktu. I mean, it's amazing. And one side, I'm very proud that this is our valley. I think it is beautiful. I think it is so, and I'm proud of the people that are in it. And on the other hand, I'm a little upset. Kind of like to keep it all myself. Blow up the road and railroad it. Won't dredge the harbor, but you can't go back. And I do think we have a wonderful future with the young people that are coming into the valley. And I really do. That's if they get an education. I'm wondering.
Once again, thank you very much. A round of applause for Ellen Grant. And also thank you to Tor and to Dort for the Brackendale Art Gallery for tonight. Thank you. Just a couple of notes. After the talk that Ellen just gave, we've got some postcards that the Squamish 2014, in conjunction with the Squamish Historical Society and the Public Library, there's a couple of photo scenes of Cleveland Avenue. And this one is here with the sloughs and the bridges on it. So if you guys want to just check it out over there, we're giving these away by donation. So if you'd like to have the set, they're all there, and you'll see the different photos from 100 years ago till now. I'm just going to let you know that the next chat that we're going to be having in our speaker series will be 7 p.m. Thursday, October the 9th, here. And it will be the geological history of Squamish with Dr. Steve Kwan from Quest University, Canada. So hopefully you can make it then. And if you're around November the 13th, Corrine Lonsdale will be here speaking about Squamish 50 years of change and challenges. And if anybody is interested, we've been celebrating 100 years of Squamish this year, but this is the Squamish Valley. And in 1964, is when it amalgamated, and so the Squamish Historical Society will be celebrating the amalgamation probably at the end of November, early December, so to keep abreast of the news. But we're just wondering if anybody is interested in taking part in organizing or volunteering for that event. We'll be having a short meeting after this presentation, so just come over and talk to Betty and Deidre and myself, and we'll let you know a bit more about that. And finally, just another plug about the Squamish Historical Society while we still have beautiful weather. If you haven't had a chance to check it out yet, the Downtown BIA and a bunch of other sponsors, we put together a walking tour. So there's a big map down by Winnipeg and Cleveland Avenue. And you can grab a copy of the map if you'd like to go on your own self-guided tour. So once again, thank you so much, Ellen. Thank you so much, Tor and Dor, and have a lovely evening. Thank you. Complimentary. Hold on. Oh.